Appreciate everybody. We have started recording, and I think we have a couple other panelists who are joining us soon, and great.
I'm in.
Okay, wonderful. We're figuring out the tech and rolling. I'm gonna go ahead and start introducing our panelists and our topic, so we can roll into this. But hello, everybody, again. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our virtual event called Cash Without Conditions. Thanks for joining us on Zoom. We're also on Facebook Live at the UpTogether Facebook page. If you have issues, you could also go there. My name is Patton Dodd, and I am the Executive Director of Storytelling and Communications at the H.E. Foundation in San Antonio. And I have been able to see and hear firsthand what kind of impact Cash Without Conditions can truly make for families in our community. Families like the one that's led by Janika Brown, who is an UpTogether member that was actually going to be our moderator, my co-moderator today. And she planned to welcome everyone, share about her life here in San Antonio and receiving cash investments from UpTogether, but unfortunately had a bit of an emergency this morning. So shout out to Janika. We're praying and hoping that her circumstances improve quickly. And this means I get the honor of being your moderator for this afternoon's conversation, and I'm pleased to do it. I want to say a quick word of introduction about our two host organizations. First, UpTogether. They're a national nonprofit that highlights, accelerates, and invests in the initiatives that people in financially under-resourced communities are taking to improve their lives and accomplish their own personal and financial goals. And then the H.E. Foundation, we're a private foundation that's based here in Texas, headquarters in Kerrville with offices in Lakey and here in San Antonio. And we work to cultivate wholeness in people and institutions for the transformation of our communities. More and more frequently, I know we're all hearing topics around guaranteed income, cash transfer programs in our conversations. It's part of local and national politics, and it's reshaping the way that government and private donors address issues pertaining to poverty. We know that the varieties also of relief dollars and packages that have been in the news that were sparked by COVID have brought more and more attention to these issues. Many of us, most of us in the nation, in fact, have been impacted by that personally in one way or another, and certainly heard the discourse. And that's why today we gathered leaders on this issue, local leaders in San Antonio, who can help all of us dig deeper into this topic and really get to the heart of why trusting and investing in our communities directly is the real solution to fighting poverty and economic segregation. In San Antonio alone, UpTogether, the H.E. Foundation, and other local donors and national donors are investing in 1,000 families to provide direct cash assistance without restrictions on how they spend those funds. And these families can also join the UpTogether community, which is an online platform where they can create groups and connect with others in San Antonio, as well as cities across the country, to share resources, to share support and encouragement. These issues are so fascinating and I think important for all of us, and that's why I'm excited to introduce our panelist speakers today, each of whom have different approaches to this topic of trusting and investing in communities. So today you are gonna have the pleasure of hearing first from Christina Gonzalez. Christina is an UpTogether member. She lives in San Antonio and she has an incredible story to share. We're also joined by Mayor Ron Nirenberg, who is the mayor of San Antonio and also part of an organization called Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. You also get the chance to hear from Francis Gonzalez. Francis is the Senior Director for the Asset Funders Network, which is the leading national grant maker membership organization. And they focus on advancing equitable wealth building and economic mobility. And last but not least, we're joined by David Rogers, who is the president and CEO of the aforementioned H.E. Foundation. So we're excited to hear from each of you panelists. And for those of you in the audience, we want to hear from you as well. There's going to be time for Q&A towards the end of our hour. So if you have a question for any of our panel members during the conversation, please put it in the Q&A box here on Zoom. If you have a reflection you want to share, a comment, for the whole group, you can use the chat feature for that. So questions in the Q&A box and comments in the chat feature. You can also join the conversation on social media by using the hashtag #CashWithoutConditions. So please use that hashtag to share your thoughts more broadly about today's discussion. Okay, so panelists, let's get started. And the first question is for Christina. Christina, I have heard that you are passionate about our San Antonio community and that you have an incredible story as it relates to being a hardworking person and taking care of your responsibilities. I know there's a lot to tell, but what is one important thing as we begin here that you want all of us to know about you?
Okay, so thank you, Patton, for your question. And of course, thank you to UpTogether for giving me the opportunity to be here and just share my thoughts. Most important thing about me is, of course, my love and dedication to my family and their future. And of course, my desire to just help make changes in this community any way that I can.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. Can y'all confirm that, because I don't see it on my screen, that the mayor is with us before I ask my next question? Okay, I'm gonna pause until we get confirmation. Not just yet. Okay, he's still on his way. All right, so I'll come back to Mayor Nirenberg in a moment. So David Rogers, next question is for you. Again, president of the H.E. Foundation, which has been a leader in driving private donations in support of this approach that we're here to discuss. So David, what led you to pursue a partnership with UpTogether that would bring this program to San Antonio?
One, it's great to see you all. Look forward to having the mayor on board here. About 5 years, actually a few years before COVID, our organization was really in a transition, thinking about our strategy and how we wanted to support families, particularly families in San Antonio living on the margins. And so it was a steep learning curve for many of us, mainly me. And someone introduced me to a book called The Alternative. And the subtitle is, Most of What You Believe About Poverty is Wrong. Well, that spoke to me because I was pretty sure most of what I believed about poverty was probably wrong. And the book was there's not many books that I read that really changed the way I think, but this one did. And the book, three things that the book did, beyond several more than that, but it clarified that there are so many families that are just right there on the margins, one flat tire on their car, one health crisis, one missing paycheck, just puts a spin. And these are hurdles that I don't know about, that I've not experienced. And so I got to learn through that book about there are some really small hurdles for me that are big roadblocks for others. I learned also that there's a lot of hoops that people have to jump through, burdens and rules and regulations for someone to get certain help. And I also learned that we can trust families to make good decisions for themselves if they had a little bit of extra funds. So those were three of the big things that, hello, Mayor, nice to see you.
Hi there, sorry about the technical difficulties.
That's okay, that's all right. David Rogers, and thank you for all you do. And I was just beginning to share about how we, the H.E. Foundation, decided to get into this. So that was the learning that I got from that book, The Alternative. And we quickly activated. We heard that Austin, through St. David's Health Foundation, had started working with UpTogether. We met Jose and his team, and they invited us to come out to Oakland to meet some of the people that have experienced this, have gone through this initiative. And we went out there, did that, learned quite a bit, came back to San Antonio very enthusiastic and ready to see, let's try something different. We've worked on, at least the country has worked on poverty for a long, long, long time. And it seemed like we ought to try something different on a small scale in San Antonio, in our backyard. And that's when we gathered a group of funders to tell them about it. We gathered some city government leaders and elected officials to make sure they understood where UpTogether was coming from. And then we also had some nonprofit organizations whose constituents who could benefit from bringing UpTogether here. And so that's kind of how it happened. And it's been an exciting ride.
Great, thanks for that backstory, David. Mayor Ron, I'm gonna let you keep catching your breath for a second and ask Francis Gonzalez our next question. Francis, I know that your work focuses on developing and advancing policy in support of greater opportunities for families and children in Texas and also New Mexico. In your experience, Francis, how can communities help drive policy change?
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about just guaranteed income as an initiative, as a program. You know, it has a very long history. It's been around for a very long time. It began its really surge in the 60s, and Dr. Martin Luther King called for a guaranteed income program when he was speaking about moving people forward. And, you know, when you think about policy, it is really a decision to be made at not just the local level, but it can be made at state and national levels. Spain created a guaranteed income program during the pandemic and provided that for all of its citizens. Brazil has been doing it for years. And again, people are moving out of poverty because these safety nets of additional income have allowed them to know that these are dollars that are going to come to them every month, and they can begin to build this disposable income for their goals. Because people are poor doesn't mean they don't have goals. They just don't have the flexibility and the resources to activate on those goals, right? To move them forward. So I think that when you think about policy, there's a lot of opportunity at again, every level of government to activate around cash assistance. Keep in mind that Social Security is considered a universal basic income. It comes every month, and people use it, right, for their basic income. Folks might say, well, you know what, I paid into that. That's true. But when you think about the supplemental program that Social Security has, it's often for other members of the family who may be too young to have contributed, but it is something that is counted on, right? We have other programs at the federal level, the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit. All of those are programs that people can count on month in, month out, and can use, again, to build on and to get to those goals.
Thanks, Francis. That's really helpful context. And I think it's, relevant to a question for Mayor Nirenberg. Mayor Ron, we've seen you advocate for a range of policies to support investing families with limited incomes. What role do you think local government can best play in combating the challenges of poverty and economic segregation that we're facing in San Antonio?
Well, thank you, Pat, and it's great to be on with advocates in our community for people, which is hopefully something that we've all come away with over the last few years, is that there are really effective ways that we can advocate for people that are addressing some of the root causes that we see exacerbated during the last few years of the pandemic. And I believe fundamentally that local governments have a major role to play in combating poverty. And you said it, in cities across the country that are gripped with, and it's not anything different than you would see in most urban areas, there is a stark level of socioeconomic disparity that many times has its roots in redlining practices that helped further the divides of asset building. You couple that with the incredible opportunities that are availed to people who have means, and you create what we have seen now in San Antonio, which is decade after decade after decade of multi-generational poverty, which continues to grow and expand so long as there's no interventions to address it. And so, having recognized all of this, local governments, I believe, can position themselves to intervene. And that's exactly what we've done in San Antonio. And that work began in earnest before the pandemic began. And it just so happens that during the pandemic, when there was an unprecedented level of opportunity, given resources that were coming into local communities from the federal government that really took the form of cash and financial assistance to those families who were affected, we can intervene. And so in San Antonio, we first started in 2017 by adopting an equity-based budget where we allocate resources to areas where the needs are the greatest. And quick to remind folks that this is a very reasonable thing to do. In fact, it's a smart thing to do. That's the way you budget your household. You apply the resources to where they're needed the most. And that can be done at the citywide level. Since then, we've made key investments to economic mobility, most notably through work that began years ago with Pre-K for SA, establishing an early start to an educational pipeline that created equity within the youngest learners, but also work and innovation through the K through 12 system that has been driven in large part by the H.E. Foundation and the work that H.E.B. and its partners have done. But prior to the pandemic, literally months before the pandemic began, we launched Alamo Promise, which provides free community college tuition to any Bexar County high school graduate. By and large, we've expanded the program to touch more and more high schools along the way, but leveling the playing field and offering higher education opportunities to families that had never seen it before. And when we say higher education, it's not just about four-year degrees, it's also about technical certificates, post-secondary credentials, simply noting the fact that every single job that we're creating in this modern economy that pays above a poverty wage requires some form of post-secondary education, whether that's a technical certification or a 2 or 4 year degree. Notably during the pandemic, we launched a workforce program that is taking roughly $250 million over the next 6 years and getting adult workforce that had been underemployed or unemployed as a result of the pandemic or just systemic multi-generational poverty into training programs that would allow for the acquisition of a credential that gets them into an upwardly mobile career. Lastly, I'll note that another fundamental building block of an equitable economy is access to safe, affordable housing. And so we began that work back in 2017 and established a compassionate and comprehensive housing policy that worked towards a healthy ecosystem that creates affordable housing at every income level. During the pandemic, that was stressed, obviously, but we took roughly $200 million and we allocated it towards emergency housing for folks. We've been a model nationally that has saved eviction or foreclosure for roughly 65,000 households. And just recently, as we've kind of moved through into the recovery phase of the pandemic, we just had successful passage of $150 million housing affordability bond, which is the first in the city's history, and we'll continue to build on that framework to ensure that housing remains a building block for a strong economy rather than a weak spot.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much to this, right? There's levels and levels and levels to this conversation, and that's a lot. Thanks for that broader context, Mayor Ron. Christina, I'd love to bring this back to you and hear more about you and your perspective. When we talk about poverty, most conversations about poverty tend to begin by focusing on what people lack. What they don't have, instead of on what their assets are, what their existing strengths are, what they do already have. With that in mind, what's something positive that you feel most people don't realize or would be surprised to know about families with limited incomes?
It would definitely be just the unity and strength within the family. With my family, we know how to make tamales. I'm a great cook. So there's been many times when we're in need where we use that skill to, sell tamales. We will get a little factory line together at the table. We get the kids involved, they're either rolling the masa or, counting the orders, just kind of wrapping them up for us. But in that moment, we're making memories. We're teaching them something that they can use, in their future. They can pass it down to their kids. But in every situation that we've gone through, it has brought us stronger. It has brought us closer together. It's taught us that we can get through this together. So in a lot of families that are low income and are struggling, they do come together. I've witnessed that. I've experienced it within my home. It brings us stronger together because we do want to grow. You know, I want to grow for my children. I want my grandchildren to have better lives. So that is going to be teaching them that we can get through this. We can get through this struggle. We can come together and just do what we have to pay our bills, to move on to the next chapter in our life.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for that, Christina. I think so much this conversation, like it's at the intersection of people's real lives and challenges that we can see and experience on the ground, and then the policy level. And sometimes we tend to tip into one or the other. And so I appreciate the perspective you're sharing and how we're kind of trying to weave this together. And I'd like to kind of stick with you, Christina, for a follow-up to ask, what is something that you would like for leaders in San Antonio, in Texas, elected officials, policymakers, people who fund these things, what more would you like them to know about you and about your community?
It definitely goes with my last answer. I've been disabled since I was 33 years old, and which meant that I was no longer able to work a full-time job. I have children that I have to take care of, so that is heartbreaking. It's hard to just be told you no longer can because of your health condition, something that I can't change. Over this past 7 years, I've gone through 5 surgeries. I've had to do many plate sales. I've had to sell many tamales to be able to pay my bills. And the community has never hesitated to stop and buy a plate. They've never hesitated to share a Facebook post. I've had strangers reach out to me to just pray for me and my family. I've had people pull over at a benefit plate sale to just say, hey, I can't buy a plate, but can I pray for you? So that does mean a lot, because I've seen this community have love and compassion for somebody that they don't know. I've seen, my family as well, know that what I'm going through and just want to lend a helping hand, want to help, want to sell benefit plate sale tickets. They know my struggle. And that of course means a lot, but to have just the community in general that I don't know, reach out and say, hey, I'll buy plates. Hey, I'll buy tamales. It shows that there is a lot of loving and caring people in this community, especially when they say, hey, here's $2. I can't buy the plate, I can't buy the dozen, but I can give you what I have. So I've seen a lot of the love and compassion that people have.
That's awesome. Thank you, Christina. Yeah, every time, we do a lot of storytelling about communities like the one that you're in, and I often come away feeling a sense of envy about the richness of community support that's there. I don't have that. My community is more kind of dispersed nationwide. So I love that. Thank you. Mayor Ron, when you hear, about stories like this, and I know you're well acquainted with the situations that a lot of communities in San Antonio are facing, I'd like to ask you to reflect for us about what you've learned about the direct cash issue in particular among the range of policy levers that you may have tried to pull through this work with UpTogether, direct cash programs. What have you learned so far through being part of this work?
Well, I think we learned what we hoped we would find, which is that when given the opportunity and the means to address issues that are unique to an individual family, they will do what is necessary and, address the needs that they have in order to get to a better place. And so, that's the challenge with a lot of the assistance programs, that try to make the rules for the families themselves, is that, you put strings attached to assistance that is intended to get a family over a crisis or get a family to a next level of opportunity. You're assuming that you know everything that the family is facing, and that's just not the case. But with the direct to cash assistance, whether that was through the workforce program or through this particular direct cash program, we've seen the exact opposite. Overwhelming majority of the participants in this program use their funds on basic needs: utilities, rent, mortgage, other bills. A third of those surveyed reported that they had a decreased risk of eviction or homelessness. And you think about the massive amount of attention and effort we're putting from federal to state to local level to prevent evictions. When provided cash assistance, families did it on their own. A quarter of those surveyed reported an increase in the overall assets. And another learning point for a lot of policymakers over the last decade is how important asset building is to get folks into an upwardly mobile, economically mobile situation for themselves and their family members. I'll go back to something, though, that I think Francis mentioned, which is that they also are able to achieve goals, you know, and I love this notion that policymaking has to shift from a deficit mentality into one in which we are considering the gifts and the skills that every individual family brings to the table to help, you know, take their situation to a different place. And so when given the opportunity through this program, residents were able to maintain housing security. They were able to work towards goals, such as saving for a house or starting a small business. These are exactly in line with the intent of the program, which is, again, to build social capital to alleviate poverty and build financial assets. And it's really remarkable. We had one story in which an individual recipient of the fund was able to purchase a computer so that they could train for a job, which now they have as a coding credential, is now ultimately translating into an actual career. This was made possible from you know, not assuming that we know the outcomes and the needs of every single family, but trusting them to make good decisions with the assistance provided.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, I'm glad you told that anecdote. That's a really powerful one. And the asset framing piece is so vital. David, you've had a few minutes to kind of marinate on what people are saying, a lot of Christina's story and then mentions of policy. I'm curious, as you have worked on this and then also hear this conversation, how do you reflect on this as someone who's in the funding community? What role do you think funders ought to be playing in this community work in San Antonio and across the nation?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. And before I answer that question, I want to say I ditto everything the mayor's just said, and I guess that's why you're the mayor, Ron. Exactly. I mean, you just word for word, bullet for bullet is what I feel like UpTogether has done. And Christina, you said something a little bit earlier about your family first and your community. And that's what I think UpTogether is different from any of the other programs is their platform. I mean, you can join onto this platform and that community begins to expand, not just in San Antonio and how to have new relationships and friends and people that can support one another. That I think is really important that I think we sometimes miss about UpTogether and why it's different. So I just wanted to highlight the community effort that this does, and it gives you, it gives you the relationships and other people that can support you or support, each other, mutual beneficial. So your question, Patton, in philanthropy, I've learned over the years, one philanthropist or one foundation, one foundation. So we all work differently and we all have our passions and what we feel like is important. But what I've learned is, use our strengths as well. And our strengths through our work that we've done with Laity Lodges, we are a convener of people. We're a convener of people that have ideas and experience. And what we feel like now that we're doing this work in San Antonio, that's where we want to bring people together, people from different zip codes that don't know each other, that don't really see or hear or feel their neighbors' issues that they face that others might not face, and come alongside of them. So I think one of the things that we are going to do, again, using our strength, is bringing people together to provide some really important conversations. I think we also need to immerse ourselves more into the community. I mean, I think that's one of the things I've done personally, is to really get to know the community. And that's where one of you all said already, well, it's the asset, but then you learn what the assets are, and you go in deep and strong with what are the assets there? What are the community leaders saying they need? And be a little bit more aggressive and maybe a little bit more risky. And I think this, and dive in. So I would wish that philanthropy would be a little bit more risky and try small projects, small things that's trusting people, as the mayor said, to know what's best for them.
Yeah, let's experiment and learn our way forward, iterate our way through this really problem that often seems insurmountable, but we can take these cracks at it in experimental ways. Maybe a similar question for you, Francis. You can reflect on what you would like to see that experimentation to look like. But what sorts of policy considerations do you think funders and political leaders and other nonprofit leaders ought to be kind of keeping in mind as they're thinking about these kind of cash transfer initiatives?
So let me sort of frame this in a slightly different way to get to your question. But I appreciate the mayor listing all of the things, all of the policy efforts that San Antonio has undertaken, because that is not happening across the country, right? And so you need leadership for that. Our challenge with that is, I think, part of what David is describing, and that is we have to restrain ourselves from creating this sort of scarcity framework. And what I mean by that is, if we're going to dive into a cash assistance program, let's understand what we're talking about, especially here in San Antonio. Let me give you an example. So as we look at what it costs to live here, as an example, things are changing all the time and cost increases are affecting everybody. But in Bexar County, a single individual needs $12.15 an hour to just pay for basic things, the ones that we were just talking about, housing, transportation, et cetera, a single individual. A family of four needs $30.44 an hour for basics. We're not talking luxuries, we're talking basics. If there are children in the family, that amounts to $36.46. Okay, and this is information that the United Way is using right now, called ALICE. It talks about families that are asset limited, income constrained, and employed. So we're not talking about people who aren't employed. We are talking about the working poor. But because it is expensive to live in a city that is dynamic like ours and across the country, and those things are changing, I think it's important to know that the basics cost money too, right? And so, and remember, families are dealing with all of these issues, plus all of the other unexpected expenses. For example, schools and school expenses. Now, so many of those things that schools used to pay for, they're being shifted over to parents. And teachers, you've heard multiple stories about teachers taking money out of their own pocket for just supplies. My point in all of that simply is, to your question, is that we need to understand the community. We need to understand the financial challenges of living in a community like ours. And we also need to think about, hey, when we're creating sort of the guidelines around some of these initiatives, let's make sure we're right sizing the financial impact, the investments we're making in people, so that they in fact are able to meet the needs that they have and to get to goals. So I do appreciate that we have the various different new public investments, whether it's in higher ed, in pre-K for SA that's ongoing. Thank goodness. It's an important high quality initiative on early child care, but also the ability to retrain and train our folks so that they can meet their needs, their basic needs in a community like ours. So to your point, I think that, to your question, I think that we need to address these cash assistance programs with real gusto, with really robust guidelines, and saying, you know what, we're not afraid. We're not afraid in investing in people, and we trust them and respect their decisions on what they need. Because clearly the mayor just indicated and told us what people are spending their cash on. It's the basics. It's what all the rest of us are doing, paying for utilities, paying on debt, and paying for their immediate needs.
I mean, there's a lot I appreciate about that answer. You know, I asked about policy considerations, and you mentioned gestured towards a number of them and a number of existing policies or potential ones. But at the heart of your answer, and I want to make sure no one misses the headline, I think, at Francis's answer, which is that we have to see the community and know the community. We have to know our neighbors. We live in an intensely segregated city, and it's up to us to cross those internal borders within San Antonio and really get to know our neighbors, and that, you know, that means all of us just paying attention. So thank you for that, Francis. That if we don't do that, we're not going to get anything else right. There's a lot of great stuff going on in the chat and in the Q&A, and I'm going to start pulling on it. And I want to begin with one that was directed to you, Christina, from a woman named Emily Cottrell. She says that she would be curious to hear if you or others in your community. I think this really dovetails nicely with the things that Francis was just saying. Have you been engaged with more traditional community services that are offered in San Antonio, like maybe some of the things the mayor or Francis have mentioned, the workforce development, education programs, maybe food pantries, et cetera? And if so, can you speak to how those different types of approaches compare to the experience of receiving direct cash? Does that make sense? Yes.
So I have, of course, the food pantries. When I first became disabled, aside from getting food from the food pantries, I was also volunteering at the food pantries. So I was able to see a lot of the other people that needed help as well. At that time, I was physically able to, you know, box the food up and unbag them and do everything that was needed. I'm no longer physically able to do that, but that was definitely a great experience to meet the people that were helping. A lot of the people that were volunteering are community members. They're ones that are also in need. You know, they're there to get assistance, but they're also there to help. So that was a big thing. I did also get my GED for free through one of the programs of San Antonio. That was not something that I ever really had in my mind because I was already over 30 years old. But as my health got worse, I know that I needed to transition into a work from home job. And GED was, you know, something that they all required, a high school diploma, you know, not all of them, but most. So a limited income, I had to find a program that helped me get that. So I was able to get my GED through that as well. So those are really the ways that I've experienced them. And then of course, for the UpTogether program, being a member of that and getting the assistance that I needed has been a huge blessing. That's awesome. Thank you for that, Christina. I'm gonna go into the Q&A. And the very first question I think is a great one, maybe a tricky one. Francis or Mayor Ron, I think this is probably for one of you two to begin. If one of you wants to go first, maybe raise your finger. But Hala asks, given the limitation of resources and the great scope of need, how do we sustain this work? How do we sustain direct cash transfers from what we're doing with UpTogether, perhaps all the way up through to a basic income of some kind for families who need it? What are some best practices that you've seen? Francis, you mentioned a long history of this work. What have we learned in a distilled way from that long history? And what are we learning now? And do any of these programs have a time limit based on available resources?
Sure. So I think, Mayor, I'll go first. So I think that we just completed a brief called Guaranteed Income. It's a primer for funders. I'll have the team put it in the chat, but basically what we've learned is that, you know, the programs are, I think in some ways, again, it's back to our sort of history in some of the speak around public programs, if you will. We think that if you offer something to folks, like let's say a cash assistance program, that somehow they're going to need it forever. And I think we forget that that folks in general, they are, they want to keep their dignity intact. They have immediate needs just like the rest of us. And what I think we need to do sometimes is reach back and remember how hard it was for us and when we were either single, newly married, or whatever it might have been, to just make it, right? But when you reach out and take advantage of a support, you're not going to stay on that forever. And I think what we also need to keep in mind that these cash assistance programs are doing is providing an opportunity for folks to build towards their goals. Folks want to be able to get a better job. They want to be able to seek out a better rental. And so many times these cash assistance programs are helping them do that. But they know exactly, because they're resourceful, they know exactly how much it's going to take from week to week, from month to month, to strive for that next level of living better. So I don't think that, I appreciate the question that perhaps there's a fear, or there's just a concern, or maybe it's just we ought to be thinking about what it's going to take long term. But I also think that when you have the types of programs that we have in San Antonio in full swing for all intents and purposes right now, high quality childcare, we have an opportunity for folks to go into the community college system. We have folks being given the opportunity to join an employment and training program. And I don't want to steal the mayor's words, but I just think it's phenomenal that we have that kind of community investing in itself and investing in its community. So I guess for San Antonio anyway, I just don't see that cash assistance is something that people are going to stay on for a long time. There's so many other great things happening. Our challenge, honestly, is to make sure that folks know that these other things are available to them, and to really communicate and message out to them wherever they are through whatever networks that these opportunities are out there.
And I'll just add briefly, Patton, certainly agree with everything that Francis said. I think we are blessed to live in a community that does support investment in people. And our community will put its resources behind those investments so long as there's community support. But I wanted to mention that I appreciate Michelle's comment in the chat, which is calling for a two-generational or multi-generational support approach to this, because this is a multi-generational challenge. And if cash assistance is not undergirded by some of the more comprehensive activities related to education and workforce development and access to good quality, high-paying jobs, then I think we're going to continue to spin our wheels. We have to make sure that we're providing direct cash assistance to families who can then build from that. But if they're building from that and don't find opportunities beyond that, then it's not going to be as effective. And so, I think that the work has to include opportunities for folks to get out of a situation where they're working 3 or 4 or 5 jobs to make ends meet, and their children are not in an environment that is conducive to educational growth on their own. That's the kind of situation and cycle that we have to break. And so it has to be undergirded by a comprehensive suite of activities. This is one important tool, but in an array of tools that have to be leveraged to fight and alleviate poverty and to create socioeconomic mobility.
Yeah, point well taken. Thank you. So in about 4 or 5 minutes, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to share some closing thoughts. So I'll let y'all begin gathering those thoughts. We're going to have more questions than we're able to get up to. I think we can, I know the UpTogether team is working on a couple of responses to the questions in the Q&A that are a little bit more technical around the UpTogether program and how it works and that sort of thing. So we can check those off as we go. One from Perry Rocheger asks about the child tax credit funding that happened, especially the last year and a half, which I know looms over this conversation a lot about what have we learned from that. I'll just quickly offer that the only deep study that I know so far of that, I think, comes out of Columbia's Center on Poverty Research. And they found that child tax credit, Perry, cut child poverty by more than 25%, pulled 3.4 million children above the poverty line while that was happening. And then among families with low incomes, more than 90% of those funds, those child tax credit funds, were spent on food, utilities, shelter, clothing, or education. And they also, I don't have numbers on this, but their assessment was that the impact of those funds on labor participation, there's this concern that it's, helped kind of constrain the labor market and lead people away from work. But the finding of the research center was that the impact on labor participation was pretty small and statistically insignificant.
Can I just add to something there? The other thing that the child tax credit dollars did was it kept people from going to predatory lenders. And I can't stress that enough. I mean, that is a sort of sector that thrives on people having barely enough or not having anything. And so when folks have decisions to make for the basics, keeping the light on and keeping the water running, they're going to go to a predatory lender for that quick cash. And so we forget that is in fact a way to spiral down again. Because those dollars come with such high interest rates. And I think we just need to add that the child tax credit dollar and a cash assistance investment keeps folks from having to turn to that sector.
That's great, thank you. There's a couple questions in here that I think one of you or maybe multiple of you can answer in your closing remarks around how do other community members support this work? How do institutions like the church play a role in this work in San Antonio? So maybe keep that in mind as you're sharing your closing thoughts. But a repeated question in the chat and the Q&A that we also hear a lot is around financial coaching and whether that is a necessary role when we're talking about direct cash transfers. And so I'm going to let one of you volunteer to answer that question. What do you think about financial coaching? Should it fit into is it a necessary requirement in a program like this? Is it missing? What are your thoughts on the importance of financial coaching?
I'll say one sentence on it. In my learning of really digging deep into the community, I'm finding that people that are living on the margins really know how to budget. And I think some others that just, we have this concept that that's what they need the most. And I'm not sure if that's correct, but maybe Francis, you can help us more with that one.
Let me put some sort of context around that, because I don't disagree with David at all. But I think what we need to keep in mind is that because the systems are so complex, and what I mean by that is the systems that we all interact with are extremely complex. And when folks find themselves in a problem with, let's say, an eviction, or let's say at a municipal court, or let's say with a banking institution, sometimes those sort of back of the house systems, like the court system, et cetera, collections, those kinds of things, those can really hurt a family or an individual for years. And I think the value that financial coaching and counseling brings to the table is helping folks methodically take care of those things one by one and getting them off their record. Because the last thing you need is someone finding themselves with a great job, no driver's license. That's probably not going to happen though, but it's going to be hard to get that driver's license back. But folks will do a background check. And immediately these things will start to pop up. So what a financial coach and counselor can do is help remove some of those things from people's background. And I think that's really where it becomes really important, again, so that folks can get back to their goals.
Sorry, I was not me. I was muted. That's a really interesting and helpful perspective, Francis. I just want to say that we all really appreciate the really good questions and the discussion in the chat. There's a lot of good stuff going on there. We are running out of time. Before I have our panelists share their final thoughts, I want to just mention that we will have this whole recording as well as snippets from it available soon. So watch your emails you signed up and watch UpTogether's social threads, Facebook and Twitter and so on to get that content. This has been a great discussion, and we are getting close to the top of the hour. And so, Mary, Ron, if there's one thing that you want everyone who's listening today and listening after this event to the recording to take away from this conversation, what's the takeaway that you want people to have?
Well, there's a lot, but the takeaway I would like folks to have that are listening to the panel is that San Antonio is committed to breaking cycles of generational poverty that have gripped this community for generations, and that we are, as a community, putting our money where our mouths are to support folks and help lift people up. And that to see the efficacy of programs like the direct cash assistance or investments in workforce or early childhood education, to see the positive impacts that those are having. Take a look at our city, San Antonio, Texas. We are a city that has ranked, unfortunately, among the nation's leaders in poverty, and we're doing something about it. And I'm very grateful for the fact that the community has been actively supporting these investments now for a few years, and we're committed to making generational change. So hopefully that's the impression people will get from this panel.
Thanks, Mayor. I appreciate that. Francis, let's go to you next. What do you want people's takeaway to be?
Well, I think one thing that's really important is that as of early 2022, there were at least 90 demonstration programs and cash assistance programs across the country. So we are clearly we are in learning phase, and we'll be able to accumulate more information about what folks are really doing with these additional dollars, and actually break some myths and bust some myths about what folks think happens when folks receive these dollars that are flexible and instead are using them for meeting goals. So I think that's really important. And I guess the last thing that I would say is that we need to be constantly reminded that a third of folks here in San Antonio don't have $400 in the bank. That's half of Black and Latino households do not have $400 in the bank for emergencies. So when you think about the opportunity to have a cash assistance program that says, hey, we trust you, we know and respect what issues you have, and we know that you will do what you need to do to get your family to the next level, and you have goals just like we do, and this is a way to do it. And so I think I want to leave folks with that thought.
That's great. Thank you, Francis. David, let's come to you, and then we'll finish off with Christina. What takeaway do you want folks to have, David?
Well, I think we all can agree here, San Antonio is a loving and caring and empathetic community. We just don't know each other that well. And I think knowing each other better could make a big difference because we're a caring, empathetic, and gracious community. And I think, just a shout out to you, Patton, and your team with the foundation. You're about to start a Know Your Neighbor campaign, and I think that's going to be very helpful. And so I think that's what I wanted to say. And I agree too about the busting the myths. And I think by knowing our neighbor, we can bust those myths. I think I'll just bet, I mean, a couple of them, I just got busted here today, just listening to the panel. So I guess that's my, my comment, Patton.
Thanks, David. Yeah, thanks for the promo. Know your neighbor. Y'all keep an eye out for it coming soon. Christina, finally to you. What do you want our takeaway to be from this conversation?
It would be stay encouraged, stay connected, reach out to people in your community, help any way that you can, you know, whether it's dropping off some bread to somebody, you know, if a dozen of eggs, help somebody clean their yard, you know, whatever you can do so that we can become a stronger community. And of course, support people the way you want to be supported. Lend that hand that if you've never been in a situation where you are lacking something, if you've never been in that situation, think of if you were to be in that situation. How would you want people to react? How would you want people to respond or to step up? Definitely use your strengths regardless of your limitations. You know, show people what you can do. You know, don't focus so much on what you can't. You know, being physically disabled has been hard because I was always a very physical person, and I had to work around with what can I do now? How can I help? How can I be a lending hand? You know, I never thought that I would be on a panel like this. I have another one with UpTogether on Fireside. And when I watched my answers, I cried because it was my story. And being asked the questions, it was really just, oh yeah, I've got this. You know, I smiled a lot and grinned a lot. And then when it got sent to me, I cried. I cried because it's very emotional to know what I go through, but also I know there's so many people that are in the same situation as me, you know, that, you know, get sick when they're young, that get disabled when they're young, and, you know, don't have a way around this. Don't get to say, I want to work a second job. I want to work a third job. You just don't have that option anymore.
Yeah, wow, that's awesome. I can't imagine a better way to end, Christina. She told us to stay encouraged and to stay engaged with our neighbors. And I think that's a beautiful word. So again, I want to thank the panelists for coming today and discussing their work and perspectives. Mayor Ron Nirenberg, Christina Gonzalez, David Rogers, and Francis Gonzalez. Y'all deserve a virtual round of applause. And I'd also like to thank our audience. Thanks everybody for signing in, tuning in on Zoom, and those of you also watching us on Facebook Live. And then after this event is over, this conversation is going to keep going. We'll keep stewing in it and moving forward together. One more thing to mention, later this afternoon, many of you are going to receive a survey about today's event. So please, we'd really appreciate it if you take just a couple minutes of your time to complete it. And okay, with that, that concludes today's virtual event, Cash Without Conditions. I know that I've enjoyed this discussion, learned a lot. Like David said, I've had a myth or two busted in the last hour, and that's good work. I hope you've enjoyed it too. So on behalf of the H.E. Butt Foundation, UpTogether, and our panelists, thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Christina.